Chapter 9. The Circle of Infantry Life. I was not at all nervous about returning to the Infantry Training Centre, Catterick, as a recruit instructor, despite the harsh treatment that I'd received there as a trainee. In fact, I was quite optimistic, as I would be avoiding the stressful work environment of ceremonial duties in London. What was disturbing, though, was that I was joining a training team which had just witnessed another recruit suicide. Trainee Guardsman Brown had planned and successfully shot himself in the platoon lines a few weeks prior to my arrival, and no counselling was offered to either the training team or the recruits. Surprisingly, I didn't even think about the suicide that I had witnessed 9 years earlier on the drill square when I myself was a trainee. In hindsight, I was suppressing all of my emotions and experiences due to my ongoing deteriorating mental health. And, if I'm being completely honest, I don't think that I was in the right frame of mind to be instructing the next generation of infantrymen. Brown's would be the 7th recruit suicide that had happened at Catterick since Isherwood in 1996. The inquest that followed acknowledged a severe failing throughout the whole recruiting process, as Brown had a history of depression and had previously attempted suicide. Brown should not have been able to progress through the British Army selection process to begin recruit training, let alone firearms training, as he was evidently mentally unstable to begin with. Despite the fact that this recruit was unstable, and even wrote his name on the bullet that he'd used to kill himself, the training team were vilified during the investigation by the Royal Military Police. At the inquest that followed, they would be vindicated, but this suicide had happened on their watch, and they will always ask themselves the unproductive retrospective question, could I have done more? Yet again, no consideration toward the mental health or well-being of the training team or the soldiers was ever provided. Furthermore, the British Army would continue to target recruits who were mentally unsuitable to be entrusted with lethal weapons, and this would lead to more suicides in the years that followed. One can't help but wonder why, after so many public inquiries, there is no psychological assessment as part of the British Army selection process. Then again, if such a test was introduced, how many candidates would actually pass it and make it through to recruit training? This raises many questions, specifically regarding the type of person the military attracts. Personally, due to my upbringing, I seriously doubt that I would have been passed mentally fit if such a test had existed when I applied to join. Maybe that's why this test is still aloof, despite being much needed. As a recruit instructor, you inevitably become a role model for the trainees, and, in some cases, a big brother or father figure. All soldiers remember their section commanders from training, and often share their experiences of these perceived godlike influential figures. My generation was trained by mainly Northern Ireland veterans, with the occasional Gulf War veterans, and at times were violent bullies. Now, I was appointed this godlike status. And would I, a veteran of Kosovo, Iraq, and 2 tours of Northern Ireland, be any different? Would my generation of battle-hardened war fighters continue to be bullies? Or would we, with our ongoing mental health battles, be any different? I could not honestly answer this question due to the lack of objectivity involved. But I can provide proof of several important incidents where change was being implemented. Personally, I was never exploitative of my position as a recruit trainer. I never took money or sold my recruits anything, and even refused the encouraged thank you gifts at their pass-out parades. I wasn't doing this for free. It was my job, and I was getting paid to do it. I was never physically violent when training recruits, and if recruits made mistakes, I never got angry or lost my temper. There was no Phase 1 and Phase 2 training anymore, and we had these guys for 6 months, which allowed ample time to correct simple mistakes. However, I would use exercise, such as press-ups or burpees, as a small punishment, as this would also improve the physical fitness of the trainee. Protocols would later come into place to restrict the amount that we could hand out, so we got creative to abide by these new rules by adding regimental variations to each exercise. I can recall catching 2 trainees asleep on stag, guard duty, on a tactical exercise. And in the field army, this is punishable by 28 days in military jail. But as these were trainees, I decided that I would have them crawl around our platoon location in the mud for 10 minutes as punishment instead. I remember that my training captain pulled me to one side and told me that this was inappropriate behaviour and that times were changing. I respected this captain, and he was only looking out for all our best interests, and I never conducted this type of punishment again. I would later strike a trainee, but I still believe that this was just, as he almost killed me. As part of their final weeks at Catterick, all recruits must complete an arduous live firing range practice at the Walkup Ranges. All ammunition used is real, and this included medium machine guns, mortars, anti-tank weapons, demolitions and grenades. Training was still focused on the attrition battles of the Falklands War, and I vividly remember leading men into a position to grenade a bunker. As we approached the enemy position, I broke away with one of the trainees, the grenadier. We crawled forward whilst the others provided creeping fire and mortar support until we came to our designated individual pens, set adjacent to each other. These pens were designed to provide sufficient cover for the imminent live grenade blast to our front, and I had completed this range on many occasions and felt safe. That was until this nervous trainee scooped the grenade and, in a bizarre and unpredictable throw, it landed an inch before my eyes, as I was still firing at the target. Time appears to stand still as I heard this trainee scream, "Grenade!" The L109 fragmentation grenade has a 3 to 5 second fuse burn time until detonation, and I was now face to face with one. Everyone around me panicked and had taken cover, and if I didn't act fast, I knew that I was toast. I've always been terrible at pool and snooker, but something inspired me to use my rifle as a pool cue, to gently pot this grenade away from the top of my pen and towards the safe area for detonation. I quickly produced this trick shot and waited for the explosion. Then there was the anticipated, horrendously loud bang, and immediately afterwards, my controlled aggression kicked in. Yet, I wasn't in control. Even before the dirt had landed around me, I was up and out of my safe pen and running toward the trainee who had thrown this grenade that had almost killed me. I remember the fear in his eyes as I steamed towards him, as I was probably frothing at the mouth in a fit of rage at the time. He was repeatedly screaming, "Sorry, Sergeant!" as I launched myself on him and threw several blows. Luckily, the range safety restrained me, and he was wearing his helmet and body armour. Fortunately, he was not hurt. Once I'd calmed down and noticed that this young trainee was in tears, I suggested that he should complete the range again. Everyone was confused as to why I had suggested this. More so, who would be willing to risk their life with this dangerous recruit? The common practice for a mistake such as this was for the recruit to be back-squatted for remedial training. After all, he was dangerous and had almost killed his section commander. However, he was my responsibility, and I would risk death to take him on this range for a second time. I had personally trained this recruit for almost 6 months, and this was the first time that he'd made a mistake. Yes, an almost fatal one. But I would like to think that he didn't aim for me with the grenade, and that it was just a bad throw. A freak training accident due to nerves. I pulled the recruit to one side, and we practiced some remedial grenade throwing until I was confident enough to take him down the range again. We repeated the range, and as we crawled to our designated pens for the second time, we were joking about his previous scooped throw, and how I would throw the grenade back to him if he repeated himself. I think I was joking. Now more relaxed, this recruit successfully threw this grenade and completed his training. Looking back on not just this incident, but on all my experiences as a recruit trainer, I do not believe that I was in a sound enough mental state of mind to be allowed to train recruits. I'd been deployed on 2 operational tours in 18 months prior to my posting to the Infantry Training Centre, and no psychological assessment was ever conducted on me beforehand. I was aware that I was struggling with my own mental health, as I'd already experienced a panic attack, and was having weird dreams throughout my time there. Additional instructors would come and go, and some even being posted in immediately from the high-intensity operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Yet again, with no mental health assessment before being allowed to teach the next generation of soldiers. This raises many questions regarding our suitability to train these recruits in this period. I fundamentally believe that because of the amount of high-intensity warfare that my generation had experienced, we were more relaxed and approachable as recruit trainers. We didn't need to gain respect through fear, violence and intimidation, as our battlefield exploits and medals were enough for us. We had witnessed great feats and acts of bravery from young trained soldiers, and had a respect for them, which was the polar opposite of the British Army of the late 1990s. Niall, now a trainer, having been posted to Catterick between 2000 and 2002, and now 2005 to 2007, had observed a seismic shift in how the recruits were trained during this 2-year period. Niall had witnessed how recruits were no longer beaten into submission but rather trained to be soldiers, good infantrymen. We knew that once trained, they would be deployed to either Iraq or Afghanistan, and they had to be prepared. As recruit trainers, we had a completely different outlook to those who had previously taught us. The British Army was currently fighting a counter-insurgency war on 2 fronts, and we were aware that in order to fulfill the British Army's needs, we needed good, capable soldiers, not the scared, uncertain ones that the previous generation had trained. Our approach to how we trained these young men may have changed, but unfortunately, the harmful training methods remained the same. We would still refer to pain, and more pertinently, emotions, as weakness, and continue the detrimental process of creating a military mindset in our soldiers that would allow poor mental health to thrive through the established behavioural training methods. As a training team, we would always look forward to the bayonet fighting lessons, and this was where we could all go a little crazy and let off some steam. It was not uncommon for trainees to break down emotionally and cry throughout this process. I can shamefully recollect reducing a trainee to tears through such proven relentless physical and psychological training exercises. This so-called controlled aggression had broken this particular trainee, and whilst on his knees, mentally broke down, bayonet in hand. He cried, "I cannot kill." It would come as no surprise that after this mental torment, this recruit would eventually decide to leave the army at the next available opportunity. I believe that due to our own battlefield experiences and expectations, when we conducted all training under controlled aggression, that we were far more intense than what we had previously experienced as trainees. Maybe at times we did cross the line and were too intense. But one must bear in mind that we were all struggling with our own mental health, and no support was ever offered or even available to us for that matter. When interviewing my platoon sergeant, Paul, from the Infantry Training Centre Catterick, he informed me that when I joined his training team, he was envious of my battlefield exploits and medals, as, like me, he had joined the army to deploy on operations, but was unfortunate to have only deployed to Northern Ireland in his career at this point. Paul was a fantastic soldier and an even better administrator. He was the complete package. Plus, he was a nice guy, which was a rarity. I found this envy hard to stomach, because there were so many men more capable than me, and I was haunted by my experiences in Kosovo and Iraq. I often thought about why anyone would want this burden, this guilt, and was gradually becoming disillusioned with military life as a result. Paul would be 38 years old before he would experience his own high-intensity combat deployment in Afghanistan some years later. He would discover the reality of warfare, especially in the casualty-intensive counter-insurgency fighting that occurred in Helmand Province. This would be an ocean apart from his romantic expectations, and would leave him with his own personal trauma and guilt to live with. When I asked him the difficult question of whether he knew that I was struggling with my own mental health whilst under his command, he reluctantly replied, yes. He then went on to add that we were all under pressure from work to train the recruits, and that was all that mattered. The mental health of the training team was an afterthought. Furthermore, the man-up military culture also played a serious part in ignoring my pain, and let us not forget that mental health or awareness training was non-existent in the mid-2000s. Paul believes that he failed me, not only as a commander, but also as a friend, and this is far from the case. This was institutional failure, and unfortunately, we were part of that institution, and would continue to play our roles. Regrettably, this was to the detriment of the recruits, as we continued to train them in the ways of controlled aggression, and instilled into them that they had to suppress their emotions, as they were a form of weakness. It was during my time in Catterick where I met Soldier S, and we soon became very good friends. Soldier S would go on to have a very successful career, and would reach the rank of Warrant Officer Class 2. With 8 years left on his service, he was destined for great things, until he started to suffer from alopecia due to the high demands and stress of the job. Soldier S had repeatedly informed his regiment that he was suffering with his own mental health, but was essentially told to man up, despite the obvious and visible hair loss now beginning to show. Furthermore, he was suffering from insomnia and was constantly retching and vomiting as a result of acid reflux. Subconsciously, Soldier S was haunted by the death of several children that he'd witnessed while in Afghanistan, and this had laid the foundations for his mental health to gradually deteriorate over time. Despite the fact that he had courageously sought out help as a senior commander, which is a feat within itself, he was despicably let down as a result of the institutional failure regarding mental health within the infantry. Even in 2014, emotions were still classed as weakness, and this can only be a direct consequence of all of our behavioral training. In the years that followed, Soldier S would endure several personal tragedies in his home life, and was denied compassionate leave due to his rank and status within his battalion. This additional domestic pressure would culminate in Soldier S going for a drive in the middle of the night with the intention of killing himself. The pressure of his battlefield trauma, work, and personal heartbreak had overwhelmed him, and, in his mind, his only escape was through suicide. Fortunately, Soldier S came to his senses and decided to seek help from the doctor. It was at this point that his battalion pulled out all the stops. But it was too late. The damage was already done. Soldier S had personally witnessed the British Army's disregard towards the mental well-being of its soldiers, and after sacrificing so much, he felt betrayed. He'd gone through the correct channels and been ignored, and it was only when he was at his psychological end of the road that he was hypocritically offered help after he'd been asking for it for years. Soldier S has now left the army, and, unfortunately, the leadership failing of a few have left him bitter towards his regiment and his service to his country. He was unquestionably loyal to his regiment, and they showed him very little in return. He had always prioritized the job above all else, including his family, and had even missed my wedding. Soldier S is just another example of how little consideration was given to the welfare of its soldiers by the Army after the events of 9/11. All that mattered to the Ministry of Defence was the mission, whether it be Iraq, Afghanistan, or the training of recruits, and the welfare of the individual became a sacrificial lamb as a result. I was intrigued to challenge my own perceptions of being a recruit instructor, and was lucky enough to be able to interview one of my former recruits to analyse his views. Jono, like myself, was 17 years old when he arrived at Catterick. He came from a military family, and has a remarkable story to share. I was initially interested in Jono's training experience and what his perception was of me as his recruit instructor. I told him about my own struggles with PTSD, poor mental health, and he just opened up and told me about his own battles and his many suicide attempts. This shocked me to my very core. I had trained the soldier. I was suddenly overwhelmed with guilt, as I believed that I had a hand in establishing the conditions for his poor mental health through the behavioural training methods that I instilled into him. I understand that I was part of the indoctrination machine, but cannot help but think about how hard we psychologically pushed the trainees. Jono informed me that I was always good with the recruits, but pushed them hard on their fitness. I would hand out press-ups for fun, but the trainees could have a laugh with me, and that I was firm but fair. He also mentioned that one of the training team scared him because of his 1,000-yard stare, a military cross recipient called Anton. When I asked if I was ever a bully, his reply was no, but there were some bullies in the platoon, but they were the other recruits. I was oblivious to this at the time, as from my experience of going through training, we had gelled as a team, as we all despised our instructors. I was pleased that Jono's feedback was positive, but was distraught about how far his mental health had deteriorated since leaving the army. The last time that I physically saw Jono was in the winter of 2010 in Afghanistan. He had recap-badged from the Irish Guards to the Royal Irish Regiment, and was operating out of patrol base Pimham in Helmand Province. Once I knew he was there, I found my way to the Sangha, where he was on guard, and we had a good chat. In the months that followed, a serious incident would occur that would change his life forever. his mental health would deteriorate so badly that at his lowest point, in over a 3-year period, he would carry around a noose in a backpack, just looking, wanting an excuse to end his own life. Jono had deployed to Afghanistan 1 month later than everyone else as a battlefield casualty reserve, and said that it was the proudest day of his life when he was informed that he would be deploying that very same day. Coming from a military family, this is what he'd always dreamed of, and when he landed in Kandahar, he was listening to the theme tune from the film The Good, the Bad and the Ugly for inspiration. After all, Nadali South, where Jono would be stationed, was the Wild West. It wouldn't be long before Jono was engaged by the enemy whilst on a foot patrol, and he immediately hit the deck, whilst the other members of the team took a knee. He recalls that he was ridiculed for getting onto his belly, but this is what soldiers are taught to do in conventional warfare. However, in the green zone of Helmand, there were improvised explosive devices, IEDs, everywhere. So you took a knee, so there was less contact with the ground, thus reducing the risk of detonating a bomb in the process. After several patrols and contacts with the enemy, this was the norm, and Jono was part of his team of gunslingers. Then, after one particular contact with the Taliban, Jono and his team were on a particular high. This is a unique buzz that only soldiers experience from their close encounters of near death. It's hard to explain what this is, but I suspect that it has something to do with an overload of adrenaline, and Jono was toying around with his pistol, a Sig Sauer P226. This particular model has no safety catch, only a double-pressure trigger. Hence, it is always loaded and ready to fire. And Jono, in his euphoria, was waving it around when the pistol accidentally went off. There was a pop of the round being fired. Then, a frightful silence. Panic set in, as Jono had just set off his pistol unintentionally and shot one of his team, his military brother, in the chest. Jono still has nightmares about this incident, especially as he attempted first aid on his brother, a fellow gunslinger, who was now bleeding out in his arms. Fortunately, this was not a fatal wound, yet the look on Jono's mate's face still haunts him, as there was no denying that this was Jono's fault. Soldiers use lethal weapons on a daily basis, and freak accidents often occur. But some can be avoided with good practices, like the grenade that almost killed me whilst training recruits. Accidents happen. They happen so frequently that we give them official names. In Jono's case, this was referred to as a negligent discharge, and many of my colleagues have had them in the past. The trauma from this incident would initiate a chain of events that would almost destroy Jono's life and the lives of those around him. Jono was sent on R&R immediately for 14 days' leave to help him deal with this tragic accident. Like most soldiers returning home from war zones for leave, no mental health awareness training was provided. On returning to his home, and already in despair, Jono would discover that his partner was cheating on him, and completely lost it. He was then charged with assault and battery and given 200 hours of community service and 2 years probation after beating up the other guy. The rest of his leave was spent in a drunken haze, and, as a consequence of his aggressive behaviour, he now had a restraining order against his daughter. Jono would try to keep this incident a secret from the army, but they always find out. Always. On his return to Afghanistan, Jono underwent a psychological evaluation, but stormed out after telling the captain conducting his assessment to fuck off. Jono spoke about this officer with loathing, as he would purposely antagonize him by saying, 2 centimetres to the left and your mate would have died. And I'm going to make sure you get charged with attempted murder." I suspect that this medical officer may have been a doctor with limited mental health training. Regardless, Jono was grounded and not allowed out of the main camp in Bastion. For the remainder of the tour, Jono would sleep through the day and be responsible for the guarding of prisoners throughout the night. He was burdened with guilt and had nothing to go home to. In fact, he didn't want to go home at all, which is a mindset that I can relate to. Jono would inevitably experience an emotional breakdown during his 2 days' decompression in Cyprus, and his life would only get much worse in the years to come. Once home, he was quickly sectioned after a string of drug and alcohol-fueled nights out. He'd been spotted trying to hang himself from a tree with the cord of a phone charger and was held under the Mental Health Act. Yet somehow, in less than 4 months, Jono was deemed fit to attend his military court-martial with no consideration given towards his poor and waning mental health. Jono would be sentenced to 16 months' imprisonment at the Military Corrective Training Centre at Colchester. The charge was negligent discharge with no intention to harm, with the option to remain in service. Jono was delighted with the charge, but not so much with the sentence, as for the past 6 months he'd been convinced that maybe he'd meant to shoot his mate. This was on the basis of what the army doctor had said to him in Afghanistan, and had laid the negative foundations and prejudice against all future therapists. Jono would be released into the civilian world after 11 months, and would move to his happy place, Burnley. His extended family had set up a flat, furniture, clothes, food, and even put beer in the fridge for him. Yet he felt lost and abandoned. He had no identity. He was 23 years old, and all he had ever known, or been part of, was the military environment. He would get a job at a local factory, but would lose this after a fellow worker deliberately ripped his poppy off his shirt. So instinctively, Jono punched him. He was now in trouble with the police again. Jono had forcefully tucked away his emotions as indoctrinated by his training, but was being consumed by his guilt. This guilt would manifest into anger, and the only outlet was violence. He would later turn to Class A drugs, as these were the only things that helped him forget his nightmares. That look on his mate's face after he had been accidentally shot by him. Jono was now having trouble paying for the drugs, his only respite from his inner demons, and was now working as a debt collector for a drug dealer. His mental health was so bad that he was now carrying a noose around in a backpack, and on the days when he didn't have any respite, any drugs, he would attempt to hang himself, to escape, to be happy. Eventually, Jono would find himself living on the streets, and after painfully admitting that he didn't have the strength to take his own life, Jono would start self-harming. Luckily, Jono would in the end find his way to the charity Shade. Shade, or the Single Homeless Action Initiative Durham, would be a charity that would turn things around for Jono and put him on a different path. But through a strange intervention, the arts. I've not tried to mention soldiers and veterans' true names in this audiobook, as many of them are ashamed or embarrassed about their stories. But this superstar, Tony Hammond, deserves an honourable mention. Tony is one of the volunteers at Shade, and was instrumental in saving Jono's life. Tony would encourage Jono to box to gain confidence and to get rid of his anger, then to perform on stage to tell his own story, which in turn helped Jono release all of his suppressed emotions and self-loathing. Shade would work with the Royal British Legion and the B-22 Veteran Performance Company, and Jono would find the confidence to perform at a celebrity-filled theatre at Weston-super-Mare. This was in 2016, and since then, Jono has remarkably turned his life around. He has steady employment and a loving partner with 2 kids. I truly find Jono's journey inspiring. At his lowest, he was contemplating suicide on a daily basis. Yet he somehow found the courage to fight off his inner demons and to finally make a happy life for himself. Then he was brave enough to share his shameful and embarrassing life experiences with me, to be used as an example to others that it can and will get better. Jono is undoubtedly brave, and I only hope that he will continue to be courageous and to seek out professional help in the near future, as he still carries around the psychological scars of his past. It's obvious to me that Jono had been traumatized by his own reckless and negligent actions with his pistol. 99 times out of 100, the bullet misses everyone. But I genuinely believe that it was the first doctor that he spoke to regarding this incident who tipped him into the abyss. I am flabbergasted that in such a short space of time, from being sectioned under the Mental Health Act to his court-martial, that no mental health support was made available to him. What is alarming, though, is the long-term impact that this atrocious army doctor had on Jono's trust in therapy and willingness to engage. He's overcome so much, and I'm hopeful that he will seek out further therapy in the near future that will enable him to learn how to manage and cope with his inner demons. He is an inspiration. After listening to Jono's journey, I began to wonder what happened to Anton. Anton was assigned to our training team, and I was asked to keep an eye on him, as he had a bit of a wobble in battalion life. The training team had been made aware of the fact that Anton had been suffering with his mental health, and we either just paid lip service to this, or just didn't care. Remember, emotions are weakness, and this is what we were teaching on a daily basis at the time. Anton was a fellow Irish Guardsman and was the youngest recipient of the Military Cross in the 2003 Iraq War. He had stopped an Iraqi soldier from throwing a grenade on his team through his quick actions by shooting him dead. He was a hero, but was also struggling with his own inner demons. The unwanted psychological scars that somehow always seemed to remain. When I spoke to Anton about his experiences of joining our training team, his reply stunned me. Anton was relieved that he was just accepted for who he was, and liked the fact that I never asked him about Iraq or how he had won his military cross. Previously, the battalion had been parading him around as if he was a trophy, and Anton really didn't feel he was worth such accolades. From his own perspective, he was only doing the job that he was trained to do. Anton explained to me that before being awarded his military cross, he was just an average guardsman, and that post-Iraq, there was immense pressure and unwanted expectations put on him. Officers would expect him to be the best at everything, from fitness to marksmanship, and he was always treated differently than his fellow guardsmen. I only worked with Anton for a short period of time, but I can vividly remember him physically shaking when I'd put a weapon in his hands and asked him to simulate an enemy soldier for a lesson. Anton then shut down and was unable to function, and I immediately removed the weapon from him and told him to take 5. This was yet another red flag that I had chosen to ignore. Anton, like Ski, would be diagnosed with a personality disorder rather than a physical disorder associated with combat. Let us not forget that this was a period when the British Army was under scrutiny due to the lack of WMDs found in Iraq. The Army didn't need any more bad press, and God forbid that one of their trophies, Anton, now had poor mental health as a result of his bravery. I cannot help but feel responsible for having a hand in both Anton and Jono's poor mental health, despite both of them stating the contrary. I had totally ignored the fact that Anton had poor mental health, to which he kindly highlighted that I was also suffering with my own. However, what is deeply concerning is how I blindly followed the well-polished military training methods that had once been used to brainwash me. I would regularly yell, "Pain is weakness, and emotions are weakness," and that they should be ignored. I would go over the top and push recruits to their psychological limits without a single thought or regard to their long-term mental health. The British Army required its current batch of soldiers to be operational ready, with many deploying to Iraq and Afghanistan in the coming months. Once they'd passed out, as a training team, we had fulfilled the Army's needs, regardless of the cost to our recruits' long-term psychological well-being. We categorically followed the previous generation in forging a military mindset that would allow poor mental health to thrive. And this is something that I often regret. It was during my time at Catterick that I began to receive phone calls about the whereabouts of one of my former lads from the war in Iraq, James Piotrowski. Ski had gone AWOL and was suspected of taking an assault rifle with him. From the tone of these phone calls, I couldn't help but get the impression from the top brass that the Army wanted to throw him to the wolves. Ski was one of my lads, and I always believed that I had a duty of care for all of them, more so the ones who entrusted me with their lives when we went to war. We wouldn't have hesitated to sacrifice our lives to save the others, and were bound by an unspoken bond that was forged on the battlefield. Ski's battlefield trauma wouldn't be taken into consideration, despite the fact that all of the incidents that caused his deteriorating mental health genuinely occurred. Ski would eventually be arrested, but gave police the slip twice more in 2 months, until he gave himself up at a hospital in Wales in January 2005. In a strange kind of way, I was proud of Ski. I'd trained him for war, and had rammed into him that if caught, he must always escape and evade, and to always fight and never give up. Maybe this was my own way of hiding the same trauma that we shared throughout the early weeks of the war. In the months before his trial, I was interviewed several times by the Royal Military Police, RMP, then later the Special Investigation Branch, SIB, and these policemen were completely biased. In the Army, you were always deemed guilty until proven innocent. These interviews were a complete joke and lacked objectivity and were more like interrogations. Initially, I was dragged by the RMPs out of a skill-at-arms lesson with my recruits without any warning. Immediately, this felt like a shakedown, and I knew why they were here. The questions that they were asking were about Ski's battlefield experience, and particularly if he'd ever experienced any traumatic events. What the fuck, I thought to myself. Have these clowns ever seen combat, or even been deployed in operations? What a stupid question. I couldn't take these RMPs seriously, and began to toy with them due to their lack of operational experience. and they were failing to coerce me into painting a bad character reference about Ski, when all I was doing was praising him. Looking back, I actually enjoyed this failed attempt by these monkeys to interrogate me. I was Team Piotrowski, and that was that. Or so I thought. The following week, and again without warning, I was pulled out of another lesson with my recruits for a second interview with the military police. This time by the SIB. These guys were more experienced, older, and in plain clothes. They outranked me, and from the beginning attempted to intimidate me. The shock and awe tactics yet again didn't work on me, and I was in quite the pleasant mood, until they suggested that I was accountable for Ski's actions, and that I may also be investigated. If I'm completely honest, this did frighten me a little. But I wasn't going to abandon one of my men. One in, all in. Let's talk about the war, shall we? I answered honestly all of the SIB's questions about Ski's operational performance, and was adamant that out of all the Guardsmen I had commanded in Iraq, he was the best. Like their younger, less experienced colleagues, they were probing about the very nature of warfare, asking stupid questions about whether Ski was ever in danger in Iraq. Did he ever engage the enemy? Or was he ever engaged directly by enemy fire? Bloody hell, where do you start? I condescendingly explained that in the early weeks of our time in Iraq, we were at war, and that we exchanged fire with the enemy on a daily basis. I emphasized how it was the pair of us who had covered my section's extraction under heavy fire, after being forsaken on the streets of Basra after an ambush. Maybe Ski should have been decorated for his actions, but I always thought that we were just doing our jobs, and Ski was exceptional at doing his. They seemed disappointed at listening about his feats of bravery and professionalism, then began to ask questions about the darker side of warfare, the civilians. I could almost smell the desert again, and taste the combat. I thought about that little girl, the pregnant woman with the shrapnel injuries, and those burnt kids. I composed myself and spoke about how I had instigated the airstrike, and how I had reported the enemy fire from the village, and how this was passed up the chain of command. If anyone was responsible or accountable for Ski's actions, then it was me. What I refused to mention was my own deteriorating mental health, my own struggles with what we had experienced, and my own internal pain, particularly the harsh panic attack that had occurred after the war. Maybe, if I'd been brave enough to mention my own inner demons, then this could have helped Ski. But I was too ashamed. Even writing this, I have a severe tightness in my chest, just from recollecting this incident. I explained how we came under heavy artillery fire on the outskirts of Basra, and how later we would pick off enemy targets for fun in the investment phase of the siege of the city. The SIB officers didn't seem too pleased with the character reference I was creating, and then asked whether or not Ski had conducted any war crimes, or if he'd disobeyed any of my orders, or showed signs of cowardice. Wow. Just wow. I now lost it, as this wasn't an interview. This was a witch hunt. I told these two pricks that we were done, and that next time they came back, I would be contacting a solicitor. But I was more than happy to testify under oath in a court of law. That call never came, and Lance Corporal James Piotrowski was sentenced to 7 years and 4 months in prison. Ski's father, Mark Piotrowski, would later state his son was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder after serving in Iraq, and that he should have got better support after returning from duty in the Middle East. I genuinely feel that none of the frontline infantry soldiers who bore the brunt of the fighting in the 2003 war in Iraq received any mental health support. Dave, Mac, Pez, Stevie, Ski and myself have all since suffered with poor mental health from our experience of warfare. This raises many questions as to the root of our trauma. Was this how we were trained? Events from the battlefield? Lack of aftercare? Or was it the consequences of how I led these men in difficult and demanding circumstances? In the years following my time in Iraq, I was always proud and took comfort in telling myself that I brought all of my men home, when the harsh reality is that this is, in fact, a lie. A lie that I can no longer take comfort in, because the truth is, I actually left some of my men there. After these interviews, I threw myself into work even further. I would get my reward and be given a temporary rank of Colour Sergeant, 2 ranks up, to go and teach a group of Iraqi officers at the Infantry Battle School in Brecon. I was apprehensive, as some of these Iraqis had fought against me in and around Basra during the war, and my interpreter, Wahid, was a former Iraqi Republican Guard. This was just 2 years after the war in 2003, and, in hindsight, it may have been a bad idea. However, this was a fantastic career opportunity, and not to be missed. So, I suppressed my emotions even further, as my priority was solely focused on my career. Before the course had started, the other instructors lent heavily on me due to my battlefield experience in Iraq, despite the fact that I was 2 ranks their junior. I didn't want this added pressure, and had made it clear from the start that I was a section commander and not a colour sergeant. I wasn't even qualified to wear the rank, but this was a requirement to instruct at the Infantry Battle School. In the evenings, I had to pre-learn the instructional syllabus before I taught it the following day, and found myself drinking heavily again. I was yet to complete the platoon sergeant's battle course, which the course was mirrored around, and this would provide me with an advantage when I attended this course the following year. It was on this course that I really got to know some of the Iraqi students, and, despite my increased anxiety when around them, they were not bad guys. Of course, there were cultural differences, but at the end of the day, we were all soldiers and wanted what was best for our respective countries. Wahid, in particular, was quite opinionated, especially regarding the outcome of the war. He was adamant that if more qualified, high-ranking Iraqi officers had led the Iraqi forces instead of the weak yes-men and friends of Saddam, then the outcome may have been different. I fundamentally disagree, and we had many debates regarding this subject. In the final weeks of instructing on this course, I received a letter from my commanding officer praising me for the hard work and, in doing so, representing and solidifying the Irish Guards as a fantastic regiment. In the following days, I would receive a second invitation to transfer to the Small Arms School Corps, SASC. This is a small unit of soldiers who govern the safety aspects of all weapons training. I laughed this off, as I was a dedicated infantry soldier, or at least that is the image that I enjoyed projecting. I was always looking ahead, and this meant my next operational deployment in Iraq in 2007 as a platoon sergeant. I'd convinced myself that I was destined to die on the battlefield, and welcomed this. It was my destiny to die in Iraq, from my part in that airstrike. This was my punishment, and I accepted my impending death.